I felt was really relevant when it comes to this theme that we've been talking about over the studies around walking with the wise. Because if nothing else, this story of Ruth is about a young person who's learning the truth, or a young immigrant interested friend who's learning the truth, embodied in Ruth. And she attaches herself to an older person in Naomi. And through a mentoring type relationship over a period of years, this person embraces the truth of the God of Israel. I mean, that's the perfect sort of end of year study kind of topic. So I couldn't get away from that. It was the first thing I thought about when we were talking about it in a group. What are we going to look at? So I had this conflict that I had to deal with. Do I go with the cool theory, that there's this simple story about a young person and an old person, their relationship working together, or do I skip it because it's Ruth? And I'm sort of going into this a little bit because I've actually had the conversation with a couple of people over the last week or so about the books that we choose and the books that we like and the books that we don't like in the Bible and don't like and why we don't like them so much. But I got rid of all my preconceived ideas, and now I have to say that I've made a 180-degree turn on the book of Ruth, because once I got rid of everything, once I cleared my mind, once I looked at it rationally, once I removed all the memories of white-knuckling it through song and praise nights, singing Entreat Me Not to Leave Thee, the song and praise nights that I haven't been able to get out of, I found myself with more wisdom from these 4 chapters than I could have imagined. So our theme over this end of year studies has been based around the benefits of walking with the wise and the detriment of walking with fools. And so tonight we're going to look at both of these points in a little bit of detail, picking out a couple of incidents that come through from these first 2 chapters. And primarily it's going to be drawn from the life of Naomi and her interaction with Ruth, and with Boaz and his interaction with Ruth. And from the perspective of walking with the wise, we're going to see that our ecclesias will be the strongest when our spiritual and social relationships are strong too. And from the perspective of walking with fools and making bad decisions, we're going to look at 2 things. We're going to see that if we do make mistakes, because we will and we do make mistakes, despite the fact that we do that, we can never be so far from God that he won't take us back. And so we need to push on and we need to move forward. And we're also going to see that if we're a person who has suffered harm by the bad decisions of other people, that we can use our experiences and what we've been through to lighten the load of people who might also be suffering in the same way. And by doing that, we come back around to making our spiritual and social relationships stronger. So to start with, I want you to imagine for a minute if this happened to someone in your ecclesia. We're picturing a mum with 2 sons. She's a wife, she's a mum, she's got 2 sons, somebody in your ecclesia maybe. And she's a lady in the ecclesia, a sister in the ecclesia, who's really well liked. I think we've all got a few of these people in our ecclesia. And this sister, she knows a lot of people. And she'll go and talk to them. She'll go and talk to them if they're young people. She'll go and talk to them if they're older people. She finds something to connect with them about, or to tell them, or to talk to them about. When someone new comes through the door of their ecclesia, she's the person, one of the people there that are welcoming them, making them feel at home, making them feel comfortable in this new environment where they don't know anybody else. When there's people unwell, she sends a card to them. She's one of those sisters who remembers birthdays, just gives you a little something for your birthday, even if it's just a tap on the shoulder and saying, happy birthday for Wednesday. But she finds herself in a situation where she has to leave the ecclesia. She has to leave the home that she loves. Her and her husband have sat down and they've made a decision that they need to pack up their family and move overseas for the sake of their husband's career. It's something they need to do to help progress his career, which will help the income, which will then eventually have positive benefits in their mind, maybe around for the family. But they make that decision knowing that they're going to have to go through a period of isolation, spiritual isolation. But it's a sacrifice that they'll just have to make. One day in this isolated location, the sister's husband dies of cancer. She's still overseas. She's got no broader family or friends that she can lean on. She can't go and bury her husband in the family plot at the cemetery where other family members through time have been buried. And so her and her two sons, in this isolated place, conduct a lonely funeral ceremony in their new country. Then sometime after that, sister finds that her husbands have got girlfriends outside of the ecclesia. And she has to work through that mentally. But then the sons eventually marry these girls outside the ecclesia. Then one night, both of the boys are out, gone for a drive in their car together, in one of their cars, excuse me, and they have an accident. Both of the sons die at the scene. And so here again, this poor sister is unable to bury her children now in the family plot at the cemetery. And so in this isolated country, now feeling super isolated by herself with no husband, no children, daughters-in-law from a different nation, a different country, has a ceremony and buries her children next to her husband. Probably easier for the older married with children of us here to imagine this, because it's probably a number of all our worst nightmares as parents coming together into one horrific dream. Young people, you probably know this, but if you're lucky enough to have your parents in the meeting, these three things are at the top of their prayer lists for your future. It's not about your job. It's not about your car. It's that one day you grow up, you'll be baptized. It's that one day you'll grow up and find a partner and marry a partner who shares the same belief as they do. And they certainly don't want to have to bury you. They don't want the thought, can't handle the thought that we might have to do that. Those three things: your belief, your future marriage partner, and your life. And this is the history, with a few changes to the story, obviously, is how we're introduced to Naomi in the first five verses of this chapter of Ruth. A wife, a mother, with all her hopes and expectations for her children, with all her dreams that one day her kids are going to grow up and find themselves a good Israelite wife and become a good contributor to the Israelite community. All those hopes that she has are just dashed. She's in a country she doesn't like, wondering what to do. What would this series of events do to your personal faith? It would be easy, wouldn't it, to throw the towel in here and blame God for everything. If God was really there, he wouldn't let bad things like this happen. Like, this is catastrophic. Maybe a husband, maybe a son, but a husband, a son, my other son, my whole family. This is not the God for me. And now all I'm left with, out of all of these things, this beautiful family that I have, I'm in this Moabite country with these Moabite daughters-in-law. That could have been the way she took it. Because for a faithful Israelite, there wasn't much to like about Moab. They didn't have a very good relationship with Israel. And I'll just try and get... No, it doesn't matter. Had a couple of points there that I was going to go through, and we'll have a look up around the relationship between Moab and Israel, because this is the background to the daughters-in-law that Naomi now had. It was a nation that we know from Genesis 19, I think it is, that started because of an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. They gave birth to a son. called him Moab. Eventually, the son became a family, became a tribe, became large enough to become a nation over the years. And the nation of Moab was responsible for introducing all sorts of immoral things into Israel's worship. Think about Numbers 22 to 24, 3 chapters that are dedicated to one story about the king of Moab, Balak, trying to find a way to disrupt Israel so they didn't invade his country. And so he hires Balaam, an Israeli prophet, to try and curse Israel. Curse Israel for me so they can't come and do it. And you know the story. He is not able to do it, but he does find one way to do it. Come over, let's have a look. Let's turn up a quote. Turn up to Revelation chapter 2. Because Revelation 2, we find out that the way that Balaam could create some disruption in Israel. Revelation 2, verse 14. I have a few things against you because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. So that's what Balaam did. He said, Balak, what you need to do is you need to get all of your gorgeous women and all of your gods and get them to go down into Israel and to seduce the people in Israel. Seduce those men, teach them about your gods, get them worshipping your gods, and they'll be so distracted they won't even think about coming to invade you because they've got all these other things to look at. So that's what he does. And so for the next 500 years, Israel is stuck with this god. Chemosh is one of them. In 1 Kings 11, verse 7, we find out that Solomon still worshipped what says is called the detestable Moabite god Chemosh. And for 500 years, Israel was plagued by this god that was introduced because of Moab. And their religion and their worship was affected, and their spiritual health was affected because of it. In Deuteronomy 23, we're told that the Moabites weren't allowed into the congregation. So that's where they stood in God's view. The Moabites weren't allowed into the congregation. And earlier in the lead up to this book, in the lead up to the story of Ruth, there'd been a significant amount of conflict between Moab and between Israel. 18 years the Israelites were ruled over by the Moabites. And so it's not the best country to be moving into. And it's not the best country to be trying to find a daughter-in-law with that sort of background behind it. So how does Naomi manage this situation that she's found herself in? With all her family gone, with no spiritual support, with no family support, broader family support, and with 2 daughters-in-law from a different religion, a different cultural background, a different world. Well, for those people who were at the end of year studies camps a couple of weeks ago, she handles it exactly the same way that Joseph handled his situation. In fact, maybe Naomi even got a little bit of encouragement from the story of Joseph, because it's not a dissimilar situation. We've got, in the story of Joseph, we've got a country that goes into famine, with a big famine that occurs. We've got Joseph who's living in another country, he's living away from his family, he's living all by himself. And here's Naomi, exactly the same thing. The country's experiencing famine, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit. And she's living by herself with no family. So maybe she drew on that story of Joseph for some encouragement in her troubles. But she keeps her faith because she recognises that God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he works in ways that we can't understand, but that doesn't mean we stop working. And that doesn't mean we give up on working. It means we just keep working where we find ourselves. And so that's exactly what she does. She gets rid of any racist thoughts that she might have had about these 2 Moabite girls, any preconceived ideas that she might have had about them and their cultural practices and their sordid national history. Any doubts that she might have, why would I even waste my time trying to teach them the God of Israel? Not that long ago, they came and invaded us. They took out a bunch of our cities. They destroyed a bunch of our people. What's the point? No. She gets rid of all of that. And she loves them. And she accepts them. And she patiently builds a relationship with them, teaching them the truth and building and forming friendship with them over time. And by the time she decides to go back to Israel, back in Ruth, come back to Ruth 1, by the time she decides to go back to Israel, one of them accepts the truth, does not want to leave her, and the other one chooses to go back home. But look, there's no animosity. There's no frustration. There's no, what happens? What do we see as an outcome of the result of their relationship together? Have in Ruth chapter 1, verse 9. This is Ruth talking to this is Naomi talking to the two girls. Yahweh grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted their voices and wept. They were disappointed to be split up. Such was the extent of their relationship because of the commitment that Naomi had made to work with these girls over time and to try and teach them the truth. And same in verse 14. And they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Such was the depth of their relationship. To our older brothers and sisters, we need more of this in our ecclesias. We need more mixing and reaching out of older people for our younger people. Yes, they do look pretty intimidating with their dystopian haircuts and their iPhone addictions. It can appear that we've got nothing in common. What would we talk like? I go to work. What do they do? Go to school? Don't know. Might appear that we've got nothing in common with them. But it's through the slow building of relationships over time, void of judgment, preconceived ideas, full of love, that those relationships form. And maybe they start off weird and uncomfortable and rocky, but they've got to start somewhere. That's what Naomi did with these two girls. And to our young people, the same applies to you. What are you doing to reach out and get to know the older brothers and sisters in your meeting? I'm not necessarily, but older, I'm not necessarily meaning senior. I'm meaning older. Let's say I turned 46 the other day, so from my age up, that's pretty old, 46 up. What are you doing to actually try and build relationships in your ecclesia through getting to know people? Getting to know people in other ecclesias. It's going to be hard. We're all weird too. You're as weird to us as we're as weird to you. We don't talk, we text message. We don't text message, we talk. We appear grumpy because we're the rule enforcers, and that might be a bit intimidating. Maybe you got no idea about what to talk to them about either. I mean, do they work? Is he unemployed? Does he, what does he do? I don't know. But it's not hard to start a conversation with, how's your week been? And when I was thinking these through, I couldn't help but think about how I have seen this in my life and how powerful this is in my life. And I'll share a story about how this can work from both perspectives, from a young person reaching out to older people and from older people reaching out to a younger person. If you don't know my history, many moons ago, I went through a significant period of trouble in my life. Me and a group of my Christadelphian mates had a seriously impressive reputation in the Adelaide Christadelphian community for all the wrong reasons. Unfortunately, we got mixed up with the wrong crowd. We made bad decisions because we hung around with fools, and we were fools. We got mixed up with drugs and alcohol, something which I lost a lot of friends from in the long run. We had all sorts of run-ins with brothers and sisters at different ecclesias. We went to one, and I'm not trying to make myself look awesome here. I'm just trying to set the scene. We went to one inter-ecclesial Adelaide-wide sports outing, and we're about 5 minutes off getting into a massive gang fight with another group of the Belair boys that happened to be there at the same time. One of our Sunday school teachers, Uncle Wayne, he stopped teaching us. We were too hard to handle. We were too annoying. We thought it was hilarious. I don't think so now. Eventually, it came to the point where we were asked not to go to Sunday school or to youth group for a period of time to, I guess, in theory, think about the error of our ways and how much we missed Sunday school and the youth group. And then eventually we might ask to come back. At some point, we were allowed to come back. And people had lots of impressions about us when we came back. Some of them were justified. Why would you trust us? Why would you trust the guys that have been through this sort of situation? Why would you let your children hang out with them? But some of them were also a bit of hearsay, a bit of chit-chat. Chinese whispers had gone across the Christadelphian community, and some of them were just outright wrong. But two things that occurred, those two things that occurred, which helped restore me back, and they're not the only two things, but they're both important parts of my recovery, and I've seen them as important points of others' recovery too. And that's firstly, it's about the older brothers and sisters who reached out to me and tried to help me. One just happened to be more on a social level. That's all it was. One just happened to be on a spiritual level. I don't think they talked about it and said, let's hit him with two angles. Let's try with the spiritual, and let's try with the social. It was just two brothers who said, howdy, I'd like to help. Russell, on the social side of things, would drop in and he'd come around to our house and just catch up with me from time to time. He'd catch me at the meetings. He'd invite me over to have dinner with his family. I had my license, so I could drive over there. If they went out for tea, sometimes they'd invite me out for tea and I'd go and join the family. When he bought his new Saab, he said, do you want to come out for a spin? Gave me the keys. I had a heart attack, still drove it. But all of these things over time are building up this relationship between me and Russell. We talked about different subjects. We worked through different problems. I asked him for advice. He asked me for my advice. And slowly this relationship built and grew. On the spiritual side of things, Mike awkwardly came up to me one Sunday and asked me, I don't really know how to say this, like this is literally how it went. And I haven't done this sort of thing before, but do you want to start coming over and would go through Hebrews 11? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. As people of faith, we can go through that and find some encouragement in that. I didn't know any better. I said, yep, sure, let's do it. So once a fortnight, we started working through Hebrews 11. And then when we finished Hebrews 11, we moved on to something else. These two brothers gave up their time and dedicated their own resources to helping me out. They got over their preconceptions. They realised, here he is, I've got to do what I can to help. And they started to build and form relationships. They were true Naomis to my lost Moabite soul. The other thing that had any impact is what I decided to do to reach out to other people. I made a decision to get to know all the older people in my ecclesia at Salisbury. And by older people, I don't mean the 46 up. I mean the sort of 66 up. I made a decision to get to know them. And it was really awkward. To start with, after each meeting, I'd go up to somebody and say, basically, hi, I don't really know you, but I thought I'd come up and say g'day. How was your week? And so we would start off the conversation. Now, these relationships were really strong. Something about old people who love sharing their experiences, love talking to you, love giving advice. And if you're willing enough to take it, the benefit that you can get from that is incredible. Over the years that I built these relationships, I learned about Uncle Bill's winemaking. I'd known him for a year, maybe more. It'd never come up. He just dropped this one liner one day. Oh, I've started making wine. What? told me how he went out and got a trailer full of grapes, pushed them off, did all his thing. About 6 months later, he gave me a bottle. He said, "Here's my wine. It makes great salad dressing." It's a shocker. But then over time, how's your winemaking going? Oh, I've got the Chardonnays in this time. I'm going to try some white wine instead because you don't need to leave the skins in and all the rest of it. It's like, okay, wow, that's incredible. And here's me, driving my little Escort, having the odd surf, and that's about it. I learned about Papa John and his chickens and how he killed them, the different ways that you can kill them and all the things that he did to use the whole chook, turn the whole lot into food or soup. I even managed to befriend, which was a significant challenge, a cranky old sister whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember, who had the sourest life and unfortunately had soured her personality. But I also managed to befriend her. Those relationships I developed with my spiritual uncles and aunties helped me when I eventually decided that this is the spiritual family that I decided I wanted to grow up in. But you have to reach out, young people, and make those relationships, just as much as you have to reach out, older people, and try and make those relationships as well. And that's one of the key lessons that's come out of all of our studies so far, hasn't it? The quality of our relationships will affect the quality of the decisions that we make. That's what that proverb said. Walk with the wise and you'll become like the wise. And we need to work together. We all need to work together in our ecclesias, just like this tiny ecclesia in Moab did when Naomi reached out to Orpah and to Ruth, and Orpah and Ruth responded to it. We need to break down the barriers on either side, get to know each other, and grow together as ecclesia. Sometimes, though, we're going to suffer. We're going to suffer because of the mistakes that we make, or even because of the mistakes that others make. Mistakes are inevitable. When Naomi left Israel, things were not good on an economic or on a spiritual level. Have a look in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. It says that it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. Okay, so here we get a picture of what things are like on a spiritual and political level. If you don't have this in your margin, which or written down, circle that word or those words, judges ruled, and write a reference to Judges 21, verse 25. So it's Judges ruled, right. Judges 21, verse 25. And then let's turn back one page to Judges 21, verse 25. So now we're in the book of Judges. So we're getting a bit of a setting here. If you weren't familiar with this, we're getting a setting of where this book of Ruth is. The book of Judges is obviously when the judges ruled. And it says in verse 25, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So this is the spiritual situation that Naomi is living in. The nation is dealing with. If you're not familiar with the period of the Judges, which you should be from your Sunday school lessons, at least with Samson and with Gideon and the judges and the suffering that they went through under the hands of different nations, just those last few chapters in the book of Judges, we have a Levite's concubine who is raped. She's cut up into multiple pieces. They're sent around the nation. You can imagine what those body parts would have been like by the time they made it to their end destination. That then creates utter chaos, which almost descends into a civil war. This is the period of the Judges. It's a very typical example of what's happened in the period of the Judges. It's a horrible period of Israel's history, but it's not the only trouble occurring, because if you flick back to Ruth chapter 1, that verse continues. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. So on face value, if you were Naomi and Elimelech, you might see some good reasons for thinking about moving. Things aren't great. There's a famine. We've got all sorts of political chaos. We've got all sorts of ridiculous religious apostasy occurring. Should we move? Should we stay? So they chose to move. But despite all these issues, they forgot or ignored or whatever, that there were still pockets of people, despite all this chaos that was occurring, there were still pockets of people who were holding fast to the faith, that were still trying to do the right thing. And so they chose to move from a place where there were people still trying to do the right thing, despite what was going on at a higher religious level or a political level or a social level. Despite that, they chose to pick themselves up, move themselves into a country where there was no ecclesia, which was Moab, which we talked about before, a brief profile of what it was before. And so we see Naomi and Elimelech making a decision which was not a good decision. Now, Naomi may have had no choice in the matter. If you read the second half of verse 1, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, I think you can sort of read that. So it says Elimelech wanted to move, and then his wife and his 2 sons followed. But also I think the fact that Naomi, in verse 6, it says that she arose, this after they've moved, she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that Yahweh had visited his people by giving them bread. So the fact that she remained in Moab after her husband died, after her sons died, maybe they died separately. So after her first son died, she stayed. After her second son died, she stayed. Eventually, she hears that there's food back in Israel, so she decides then's the time to move. That makes me think personally that she was part of this, the original decision to move. It was a decision that her and Elimelech made together. Despite this decision they made and the horrific impact that it made on their family, or that occurred to their family, I want you to have a look at the Bible messaging which comes out in the next verses. And so grab a pencil for this, because there's a few little bits that I'll recommend you colour in. I was going to put them all up. If we can get it working, I'll put them all up on the screen later, but I'll take you through them. In verse 6, and I'm reading from the New King James, so your word might be a little bit different, but you'll still be able to pick it up. And she rose with her daughters-in-law that she might return. In verse 7, at the end, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. In verse 8, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return, each to her mother's house. In verse 10, and they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said in verse 11, turn back, the same word, return, my daughters. In verse 12 at the start, she says again, return, turn back, same word, my daughters. In verse 15, and she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back. She's returned, same word, to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law, same word. Verse 16, but Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back or to return from following after you. In verse 21, I went out full, says Naomi, and Yahweh has brought me home again, has returned me. In verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. 12 times in those 17 verses, we're being reminded that Naomi is returning. She's returning. She's returning. Yes, she made a bad decision, but she's returning. We've got 5 verses at the start of the chapter who cover 10 years of her life, probably more. And then we've got 17 verses that follow, which are just based around her decision to turn home and what it's like when she arrives home. If you make a bad decision, don't be afraid to go home. Don't be afraid to return home. Don't think that you can't repair it. Don't think that you'll never get over it. Don't think that you'll never be able to be accepted again or that people will never get over it. Just work with God and go home and return, because God will work with you just like he did with Naomi. And grab that coloured pencil again, because there are 3 more references of return. 2 are minor. In chapter 2, verse 6, the servants who were in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, returned." Over in chapter 4, verse 3. And she said to the close relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab." So there it is again. Just a couple of minor references. But have a look at this. At the end of this story, Boaz and Ruth get married. Naomi's life seems to be turning around. And in verse 13, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, Yahweh gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in all Israel. And may he be to you a restorer or a returner of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons.'" Don't let go of God in dark times. Naomi didn't when her family had died and she found herself alone with 2 people from a different country and a different religion. Don't let go of God when you make mistakes. Keep him there and work with him, and he'll be a returner of your life, like he was with what this story of Ruth is trying to tell us about. That he may be a restorer, a returner of life. The final point I briefly want to consider is actually from the life of Boaz, and might seem a little bit disconnected, seeing we've spent most of our time talking about Naomi and the experiences that she has done. But there's this beautiful thing that I basically wanted to squeeze in because I thought I'd never noticed it before. And I want to share it with you. This is about how we can help protect people from harm. And it relates to if it's something that we have already been through, or we have witnessed from personal experience, or we've been affected by. In the 2nd chapter of Ruth, we are introduced to Boaz. He's a very successful businessman. He's got an awesome relationship with his employees. How many bosses do you know who come in and say something the equivalent in verse 4? Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to his reapers, "Yahweh be with you." And and they answered him, "Yahweh bless you." He's got this great relationship with his employees. He's a very successful businessman. And one day, he finds out Ruth is working in his fields. And he does some remarkable things. When he finds out who she is, in verse 8, he says, Boaz said to Ruth, You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in any other field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. And in verse 9, let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? In verse 14, now Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." Invites her to go over for tea. In verse 15, again she rose up to glean. Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean even amongst the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also, let the grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Now, it's a very gracious thing to do to a new person, a new female, and there were females already in the field. It's a very gracious thing to do to somebody who is new to your field, who is a Moabite. And Ruth asked him, why are you doing this? In verse 11, we read that verse was read for us. Boaz answered, "It's been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you've left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and have come to a people who you did not know before." So why would Boaz be so affected by the fact that Ruth had given up everything and come to join Israel? Was he just excited that the truth was being spread? Possibly. Come back for a minute to Matthew chapter 1. So Matthew chapter 1, we have the genealogy of Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we read that Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz begat Edom by Ruth. Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. Isn't it possible that Boaz wanted to ensure that Ruth didn't have to go through everything that he'd seen his mother go through when she left everything, when she left her home country, she left her city, and she came and joined the people of Israel? He was doing a bit to make sure that she didn't have to go through the same as well. We can't pretend that Israel was some sort of utopian nation where nobody gossiped and nobody talked about, things behind people's back and shared little bits of dirt and little bits of information about tidbits of information about other people. Rahab was a prostitute who came to live in Israel. People would have had their little snickers and their little comments about Rahab. "No, I don't want you to go and play with Boaz today." Or, "No, Dad, I'll go and pick up Billy from Boaz's place. We don't need you going over there to see, to Rahab." The little comments that might have been made, the little suspicions that might have been made about Boaz's mum being a prostitute. And Boaz, what he had to deal with being the son of a prostitute. We know what the Pharisees said. "We know who our father is. Do you know who your father is?" Boaz probably got a bit of that too. "You sure Salmon's your dad, Boaz? Could it be someone else because your mum was the prostitute?" The pain that he went through, he wanted to make sure that other people didn't have to suffer the same thing. And so when he saw that same scenario arise with Ruth, coming from a country with a sort of reputation, coming into Israel, knowing what was probably going to happen, he spoke to his young men and he had some words with them. "Don't reproach her, don't rebuke her, don't do this. Make sure you keep your distance." And he made sure that she had plenty of food, because Rahab probably found it hard to do all of those things. So we can be affected by the bad decisions of other people, by people who are not thinking properly, are not thinking godly, and making unfair judgments. We can be affected by those sort of things. And so if we've been through experiences where we can share our advice, we can share our wisdom, we can make sure people don't have to suffer to the same extent. Maybe it's through marriage problems. Maybe it's through kid problems. Maybe it's through addiction problems. Maybe it could be any sorts of things. We can share and build up each other, protect each other, and so doing, strengthen our community and strengthen our families. And so now we come to the end of our studies together. We've spent a lot of time considering the relationships that we have and the decisions that we do and who we interact with and what goes through our minds and what helps us make good decisions and what helps us make bad decisions. And soon everything will flow back in. We'll be back at school, we'll be back at work, we'll be back doing all those mundane, everyday things. And we have to make those choices now. We have to start thinking, what am I going to do? What changes am I going to make? Who am I going to start making good relationships with? Whether you're a younger person, whether you're an older person. What are we doing to build ourselves up. So our community, so our ecclesia is the wise, is making wise decisions. This is something that we're all tasked with. This is something that needs to be on our prayer lists. This is something that we need to be self-examining ourselves for. And it's a never-ending task. But at the end of the day, this is what it comes to. This is what we're called to do. We're called to become wise and make wise decisions. And God bless us to that end.